All right, well, welcome to all of you watching this recording. This recording will focus on, we're still on chapter 2 in the text, American federal government. In this recording, we'll look at the debates and the process of approving and finally developing the Constitution, and then also go into some detail on what exactly is in the Constitution. All right, so here we are with the U.S. Constitution. We talked about the process of getting to the conclusion among many of those in some position of authority that there was a need for a new Constitution. And so now we're looking at that process of making this new Constitution. At one time it was new, of course. Now it's over 200 years old. And so you'll see early on in this part of the chapter, you'll see an interesting review there or reference to the historian Charles Beard. And this is on page 43 in your text. This is something for all of us to consider. That according to the historian Charles Beard, the Constitution is designed to protect the status of the elites that made it. And so, you know, clearly there were different levels of decision-making and authority, just like in any society. And so you did have an elite that was far more educated than average people at that time in the 1780s. And did they then make sure that the Constitution was written in a way that would help them protect their financial status? Some of the issues that you can certainly look at in the Constitution to wonder about that issue is the ongoing process of protecting the slave trade, making sure that debts were going to be paid. And so it's worth noting that. I appreciate that your text brings that out, perhaps a bit of a contrarian view about the making of the Constitution. But what we can see here is that there were areas of consensus that the authors of the text point out on pages 43 and 45. Most people then who were debating this new Constitution wanted to have dual sovereignty, so that there would be this ultimate governing authority divided between two levels of government: the national government or central government, and then regional governments, state governments. So that ongoing debate that we see still with us today. But there would also be constitutional supremacy. And so that's the supremacy clause, that the Constitution would be the supreme law of the land. All institutions, all levels of governing authority are to follow the Constitution. And there's also a separation of powers. No one group controls all the governing functions. So no one branch of government, no one individual within a branch of government. That is certainly the goal. And these are areas that were in consensus at the making of the Constitution, Philadelphia, 1787. Interesting area for debate here is why don't you, or interesting area of reflection, I should say. So we'll have some discussion in face-to-face classes. But those of you taking this class online, again, use this opportunity, pause the presentation and just write down in your notes what you think might be an issue in which states should have ultimate governing authority. So it's not up to the central authority, it's not up to the national government, it would be up to the state governments. Think that one over. But there were areas of conflict, and your textbook points that out. And so one of the main areas of conflict, perhaps what did take up the most time at the constitutional debate, at the Constitutional Convention, was on representation. How should this representation be determined? So he had two main plans, Virginia plan and New Jersey plan. And there's some other features about both of those plans in these pages 46 through 50. The key part of the representation focused on how would the representatives be counted and determined. So here you can see in the Virginia plan, the representation is based on population. So it is going to be proportional, and there's going to be some states that would clearly have more representatives than others. Now, should that be the case, because some states would have more population than others? The New Jersey plan, equal representation among states, which is also then a feature that was with the, at that time, current Articles of Confederation. So to keep that feature going. So in that sense, consider why would delegates from these states have these positions? In some ways, it's fairly obvious, right? If you are a delegate to represent Virginia, then you're thinking of what's in the best interest of Virginia, as the same for New Jersey. So if you just look geographically, look at maps at that time, and in some ways, those maps haven't really changed. I mean, Virginia is just a larger state in terms of land size in New Jersey. And certainly at that time, Virginia had the opportunity to get even larger in terms of its population, continued to move out west, where that was not a possibility for New Jersey. So there was some realities in terms of how many people were in those states and then how many people could be in those states. And that would have some impact and the driving impact really on how those delegates would view the best form of representation. So we get this outcome. It's brought out on page 46, compromise. And I think in many ways we can see the importance of compromise, would not have the ability to move forward and have a constitution and have a country, have a united country that could continue to proceed and develop new ideas, provide new opportunities, if there was not some compromise. And so the main compromise that we see here is the Connecticut Compromise. The details of the Connecticut Compromise are found on page 46. And one of the key details is the bicameral Congress. So you have two houses within that Congress. You have a House of Representatives, which is reflective of the Virginia plan. Representation is proportional. Some states have more representatives than others. And then you have the Senate, which is it's going to be a representative there of the, are based on the proposals of the New Jersey plan. And each state would have two senators. So two senators per state. That's the system that we have today. So you have some states that have far more representation in Congress than other states. You can have some balance in that way if you have smaller states that would form coalitions to balance out the large states. And then you have tremendous power for the small states in the US Senate. Now, one of the things that we can consider there is where we are today, and perhaps explaining some of our divisions in this country, is the structural. And it may have looked good at the time. Does it still make sense today? And how do we change that? Because there's certainly going to be plenty of small states that are not going to want to change it. But you have tremendous distortions when it comes to representation. And so this is a cartogram, which is showing, it's a specially designed map. And so the shape of states in this case are not accurate based on any type of drawing to match the accurate shapes of those states. Instead, the drawings are to fit the populations of those states, to reflect then that some states are larger than other states because they have more population. And so what we can see here is that California, Florida, Texas, New York, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania are the very large states. Now, and also within those states, it can be quite distorted, right? I mean, if you look at a state like Illinois, it is a large state, but that's not really because of Southern Illinois. It's because of Chicago. And so, so you have distortions within the states. But if you have then a representation among the Senate where it's equal, and yet you have roughly 20 or 22 or so odd states, roughly in that number, that would equate the overall population of California. And then you can see how underrepresented California is in that case. It is a very genuine question, somewhat concerning, to say, how does this system designed in the 1780s, how can this be a viable outcome for us today when our populations are so distorted, where people live and where they don't live in that case. So this is an ongoing issue for us to consider. And it's an interesting challenge for us to say, is it sacrosanct to look at what was put together in the 1780s and say, we really can't make changes to this? Or do we consider that there is something to be said about adapting to where the populations are located here in the United States? So one area then of contention was on representation. Another area was on voting, elections, who votes, what kind of elections do we have here in this country? These are areas, of course, that are continuing to change. So while the representation hasn't really changed, we have a House of Representatives, we have a Senate, who votes has clearly changed. And we'll see this in other chapters in our text as we look at civil liberties and civil rights. And then we can see that there's been changes in the structure of our voting to some degree. There's been some changes to the Electoral College. But in the 1780s, when this was put together, the conflict was, who can vote? It was a very limited amount of people. And there's been conflicts since that to try to change that to get more people the opportunity to vote. At the time, property owning white men could vote. Roughly about 15% of the population. And that may be high, actually, that number I just gave you, but roughly in that ballpark. Not that many people could vote. Most people could not vote. And then we can see here also that there was an outcome at the time. And generally, there's a lot of evidence to say the people who put this together, the delegates who did not assume that we would continue to use the Electoral College to elect a president. There would be some idea to come up with a different system, because in part, the outcome was that the Electoral College would not work. It would fail. And then when it fails, the process of electing the president goes to Congress. And so Congress would continue to elect a president. So that's why then there was a general idea to say, well, that's not sustainable. There's going to be a different system to elect a president. Perhaps then with the use of political parties is partly the explanation of why we still have the Electoral College, and with some things that have changed on it based on the original creation of the Electoral College. But you can see here on page 47 that it was a compromise between those supporting popular election and those supporting selection by officials elected to national or state legislators. So there were delegates to the Constitutional Convention that just could not abide the idea that average people would be able to cast ballots for president. Just thought that was a very bad idea, would not support it. And so there was then others that wanted a even more select few people. It's already a small percentage of the population that could vote. Now you're getting even a smaller population to be able to elect the president. So, but that was the way of getting to kick the can down the road and move on and get some system and move on to other things. You will see here on page 47, there's a really good presentation there on that page on the debate on whether or not the Electoral College should still remain. So again, just like the benefits to small states in the Senate, there's benefits to small states with the Electoral College. So it probably is one of those things that we're going to continue to see. And there was also conflict over slavery, whether or not slavery should still exist, what form of slavery, should there be processes to try to debilitate the institution of slavery with the intent that eventually it will go away. Lots of different motivations here about slavery, but there clearly were enough delegates representing enough states. So if you stop and think about it, you got 13 states and you got 5 of them, as we can see here, where slavery is a key part of the economy. It's a key part of the culture. And so in that case, that's, 5 out of 13, that's a significant number that's going to be able to block the passage of most policies, certainly to the point if they're all 5 going to stick together and go, if we don't get something that we're satisfied with, we're walking out. We're not going to be part of this new country. And so that was, again, something that could not be allowed. And so there had to be then some form of a compromise, a rather distasteful compromise. And it was a distasteful compromise for individuals at the time. You had some of the delegates saying, how can you end up with a system like this? Either someone is a human being or someone is not a human being. And so you have to then make that determination. They can't be part of a human being, which is one way of looking at the outcome of the 3/5 compromise. And that's what was determined. And so some historians can look this over and say the seeds of the Civil War, which would be fought in the United States from 1861 to 1865, those seeds were planted here in 1787 with this outcome. So the 3/5 compromise, slaves count 3/5 for the purposes of representation and taxation. That's enough, again, another can kick down the road to move on and say we've got enough people to agree to get this approved and then send it to the states to be ratified. So then there's also this conflict on the debate for individual rights. That also is part of the debate. Does there need to be individual rights? As you read through these pages, you'll note that you can see on pages 49 through 50 that part of the argument here is that there does not need to be individual rights if states have already listed the individual rights within their constitutions. You can also then, if you haven't supported this as a natural right, you can then say there is no need to have individual rights mentioned because the natural rights are assumed and understood to be rights that don't come from the government, and the government can't interfere with those rights. That, of course, is an understanding that you have to hope that future generations will continue to follow, and that may not be the case. And so that was part of the reason for the debate to say there does need to be an inclusion of individual rights in the Constitution. So you'll see here in the Constitution, pages 50 through 54, give you an idea of what is in the Constitution. So Article 1, Congress, read through these pages and get an idea of the powers of Congress. It's the very first branch of government mentioned in the Constitution. In many ways, then you can reach a conclusion when you look at the powers that Congress has, that it is intended to be the most powerful of the branches of government. The areas of authority for a president are found in Article 2, certainly something that we'll be coming back to when we cover the presidency. But one of our big challenges here is to say, where does this fit in a modern society to look at the powers of a president? The people writing the Constitution would have had no ability to fully comprehend something like a nuclear bomb. And so we're with a system today where really it is up to a president to decide to launch a nuclear bomb. There really are not any kind of ways of looking at checks and balances on that authority, that kind of decision making. So would that have been something that when the Constitution was written that the authors of the Constitution would have considered if they knew something about a nuclear bomb, which then raises this issue of how do we adapt a document written over 200 years ago to our current situation. Supreme Court, its powers on Article 3, we've talked about this before, we'll bring it up again, that the overall power of the Supreme Court judicial review is not specified in the Constitution. State-to-state relations, the idea of creating new states and also the relationship that states are to have with other states, the support and approval that other states are to have with the relationship with other states, allowing people from other states to be treated fairly and within their own states. The amendment process, how then amendments can be added on to the Constitution. An amendment is a change or an addition to the language of the Constitution. So how can that happen? How can we have new amendments? And we do have amendments to the Constitution. Supremacy of the Constitution. Again, as we mentioned here, that was part of the agreement that the Constitution would be the supreme law of the land. And then the constitutional ratification process. So how can you get this ratified by the states? And so we can see here at the end of the chapter, pages 54 through 56, see a debate here among the two main groups that were either for or against the Constitution, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, focused on states' rights and individual liberties. So the Federalists were for the Constitution, Anti-Federalists against, or at least against it in that current form. And so for the Anti-Federalists, the reasons why they were against it was they believed not enough emphasis on states' rights. And so they viewed that there was a possibility of tyranny among a central government and a few people within the central government. Always an interesting question, though, is when we think of the Electoral College today or the power of the Senate, what about tyranny of a minority? What about a tyranny of a minority population within states and what they can do to limit opportunities among populations from other states? And again, when you look at the distortions of the US population, is that more of a possibility? But also then the view of individual liberties. What about our individual opportunities for expression? Do they need to be specified in the documents? And so that was certainly part of the debate. Well, the Federalist Papers, some of the better known documents supporting a system of government like what's found in the United States, separation of powers, checks and balances, those were specified in some wonderful documents that they're collectively called the Federalist Papers. They were written by these three individuals, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Soon after the ratification of the Constitution, as your text notes, the Bill of Rights would be added on. These are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. When we look at individual liberties, civil liberties, we will certainly be focusing on those amendments found in the Bill of Rights. And we're left then with this question, is the Constitution a living document? Like any living thing, it changes, it adapts. And is that what the Constitution should be doing, changing and adapting? And if you have some issues with that, and some people do, then what is the alternative to being a living document? Is it to be then a dead document and no change? And is that best for our society? So there we can see the challenge of accepting that it is a living document, and then what does it mean if it is a living document? All right, so we'll stop there. That's where we are with Chapter 2, looking at the U.S. Constitution. The next time we have a recording, we'll be moving on to Chapter 3 on federalism.